This is a response to a video by Anekantavad. I'm not sure if that pronunciation is correct, but so apologies for that. It's a response to your latest video there, which I think is called Antinatalism and Depression 29, the 29th episode in that series about, as you say, antinatalism and depression. I haven't watched the whole series. I watched the first one, I've watched this most recent one, and I've dipped in and out in between times. And I'm returning at this point because the most recent one, at least partially, I think, returns to the themes that you set up at the beginning, which is this relationship between antinatalism and a kind of mind state, a mental state like depression. In that first one, I left a comment to this effect, but in the first one you were talking specifically about how, for some individuals, perhaps those who suffer from clinical depression or those who are of a pessimistic mindset, might want to stay away from antinatalism because it's the kind of a philosophy, the kind of idea which can either promote certain kinds of thinking, complement, exacerbate what might be seen as a condition, or perhaps provide philosophical justification or validation for what could otherwise be dismissed or contained as I say, as an idiosyncratic individual mindset. When there's a philosophy which paints the world as inherently pessimistic, inherently negative, that obviously provides some kind of justification or support for the feelings of negativity, the feelings of pessimism that many of us might have. So, and I understand what you're saying with that. That's what I'd say is a dangerous idea. And I'm borrowing that term from an Edge publication called What is Your Dangerous Idea, which was out a few years ago, in which they asked a series of scientists, philosophers, public thinkers to come up with dangerous ideas, with the idea being that an idea is dangerous regardless of whether it's valid or not, regardless of whether it's true or not. And there have been a history of ideas considered dangerous regardless of whether they're true or false. You know, many people were against Darwinian evolution being made public knowledge because it was feared that the underclasses would take that as a prompt to revolt. If it was clearly demonstrated that there wasn't any essential difference between themselves and the aristocrats, the upper classes, the landowners, the owners of the means of production, then that would sow the seeds of anarchy. So again, as I said, the evolution was considered a dangerous idea. So some people wanted to suppress it for that reason, even though it was true. And of course, religious practice, some religious practice at least, is full of that idea. The idea of repressing certain bits of knowledge because they're dangerous. So, for example, the non-existence of God is often considered by many to be a dangerous idea, again, regardless of its truth or falsity. Even people who have a very conditional and metaphorical belief in God often consider it a good idea to believe it regardless, because, for example, where would moral foundations come from if not from some design lawgiver? That's again an example of a dangerous idea, which some people would consider to be dangerous. Some people would consider to be best kept secret, kept away from the masses, certainly, regardless of whether it's true or false. And you're suggesting, or at least you did in your first video, that antinatalism could be one of those, and you kind of personalised it by making it not an idea which is dangerous in and of itself to the public at large, but perhaps has certain kinds of holds dangers to certain individuals, as I say, those who suffer from clinical depression or who have a pessimistic mindset. Stay away from this stuff, it's a little bit dangerous. I can kind of see the logic of that. The reason why I'm saying this at this point is because you kind of returned to that at the beginning of this latest video, episode 29, in which you talk about the practice of holding something above your head. I can't remember what you're referring to, medieval illustration, something like that. But this idea that the sky is a dangerous place, an unknown place, and sheltering yourself from the sky is something that's quite important because it's dangerous. And again, I think there's something interesting about that in terms of dangerous knowledge, because of course we do know more about the sky, whatever this "know" word means, by the way. Whatever knowledge is, and that's a big debate to be had about that. We do clearly have more of it in relation to the sky than we used to have, but in a way, it seems to me that the more we know about things like the sky, the more we know about the interior of matter, the more we know about time, the more we know about space, the more we know about the brain, you know, anything that we didn't know much about previously. The more we know about that, it doesn't take away the danger or the fear of it. Not because we're discovering fearful knowledge necessarily, but we're discovering the limits of our own embodied knowledge. We now know that the sky is what we think it is currently. We don't think it's a series of crystal spheres that end at the one containing the stars. We know it's something different to that. But what we know about it now is so difficult to understand, perhaps impossible to understand, I'm inclined to think, in an embodied way. We know the maths, we know the physics, we can do the calculations, but we can't occupy that knowledge in a way that perhaps we could have done, even with the crystal spheres model. It might have been scary because it was big, but it wasn't scary because it was unknowable in an embodied, cognitively realizable way. You know, we can't live in the world that physics paints. We live in this world, the phenomenological world of sensory experience, and we realize, and there's something scary about the sky that is unknowable, I think, which is a bit different to the medieval one, isn't it? But interesting again, and again, it's this idea of dangerous knowledge. Not dangerous because it's knowable, but dangerous because it's unknown and unknowable. And there's something about antinatalism there, for me at least. Or not antinatalism specifically, but some of the uncertainties around the terms that we use within that. You know, terms like what is it? What is a self? What is a person? When does a person come into being? When do they go out of being? Are we really one person throughout our lives, or are we a series of chrysalises constantly evolving into other things? Whatever. I don't know if that makes any sense even. But you know, what is our relationship to the social world in which we're embedded? Yeah, we don't have clear answers to any of these things really, and the more we know, the less we know. So there's a different kind of danger. And one response, I think, from people who would say they were antinatalists, or perhaps would occupy that position, is a kind of refusal of the difficulty of knowing. It's a difficulty. It's a kind of it's doing this and saying, no, that's the sky. You know, not taking it away and accepting the difficulty and the unknowability of a lot of that stuff. And by, as I say, unknowability, I don't mean the impossibility of gaining empirical information. I mean the impossibility of embodying that information and making it the world we live in. We live in this world, don't we? So that's something about that. The other thing you talk about towards the end there, which I thought was interesting, is about the asymmetry. You know, it's a game of two halves, this latest video, isn't it? And the second part is about the Benatarian asymmetry argument. And I gave what I think is a really interesting account, which I've heard in different forms elsewhere, but it's the first time I've heard a theological spin put on it, which is to do with, you know, it kind of depends on a calculation of non-beings in relation to beings, and an adding up and an accountancy, an economics of suffering based on the counting up of non-beings and the counting of beings, and seeing who's got the greatest suffering. And it does have hidden within it all of the things you pull out to do with, you know, what is this relationship? How many non-beings are there? If you take a being out of non-being, does that mean there's one less non-being? All those kind of things which are implicit in the metaphor, but are buried. You know, they're not made evident. There is a kind of selective editing of that particular metaphor in Benatar and elsewhere. The other thing that that's interesting, and I think tying it into this idea of the infinite and the godlike infinite of non-being is fascinating. Just as a kind of point of reference, there's an interesting response to Benatar made by a guy, I can't remember his name now, Campbell something Campbell. It's called Better Never to Have Been Believed. And it's a kind of model, a kind of analysis of the Benatarian asymmetry in, I guess, something like modal logic. He uses logic and parallel worlds and things, and imaginary scenarios to describe that, and pulls out some inherent inconsistencies in the Benatarian asymmetry, the way it's described in Benatar, and then does a different one, which I think is quite interesting, what he calls the obligation asymmetry, which Benatar has within it, but yeah, so Benatar's got that within it, but he's got the Benatar takes it in a different direction, which this guy Campbell, quite rightly I think, critiques. But what he describes is what he calls the obligation asymmetry, which is really interesting, because instead of focusing on the non-beings, on the potential children, the potential sufferers, you know, the stuff that you go into, he focuses on the moral obligations and the moral the things that are forbidden to potential parents. Because of course we do have, whilst the idea of a potential being, a potential child, is a little bit problematic, the idea of a potential parent is not. You know, we're all, those of us who are living and fertile are all potential parents. Potential, you know, that's inherent, or as myself, an actual parent. And there is a logic to that. You know, the situation is already in existence. So I think we can talk about that. And he points out, sorry to take so long about this, he points out an asymmetry to do with obligations and the idea of what is forbidden to potential parents. And the thought experiment is very simple. He says you know, imagine a couple of parents, a man and woman, and they are considering having a child, and they know with 100% certainty that the child will have a happy and healthy life. That's it, it's just 100% certain. Are they morally obliged to have that child? Well, intuition, I think, tells us no. They're not morally obliged to have that child. We might, other things might come into play. We might talk about them being perhaps selfish if they don't spread the wealth. We might talk about them not passing on good genes. We might make these kinds of statements, but we don't mourn for the loss of the healthy, happy child who didn't come into being. Our intuition just isn't telling us to do that. But if you imagine the contrary condition in which these parents are guaranteed with 100% certainty that if they have a child it will have an unhappy, miserable, unhealthy life, then I do think our intuitions tell us that they are morally obligated to not have that child. You know, if they knew that with 100% certainty and went ahead with it, you know, I think moral approbation would be in order, you know, and we kind of do that to a certain extent, don't we, in some cases already. So there's an asymmetry there, but it's an asymmetry not about the unborn, it's an asymmetry about our about parenting, and that has got kind of actual real world logic to it, and it doesn't rely on the non-existence of imaginary beings. It relies on moral obligations of actual beings, potential parents. Anyway, it took me a long time to get to the point there, sorry about that. But, thanks very much for your patience in making all those videos. I'll try and watch some of the other ones, but I'll just show you where I am right now. I'm down by the Fowl in Falmouth. This is the River Fowl, as you can see the tide is out, so it's mostly just mud flats. That is quite interesting. About 7:30 in the morning here. I love the sound of the seagulls.